Hi everyone, Sajid Amit here, and welcome to my review of the ZMF Caldera-Closed back, or ZMF Caldera-Closed. And immediately, when I show this off, it puts a smile to my face. Just seeing this amazing aesthetics. I mean, so one thing I really like about ZMF, and especially the Caldera-Closed, is that it looks different. I mean, you're not going to mistake it for the Atrium Closed or for the Verite Closed because they all look very different from each other. And this sort of faceted, aesthetic is just very stunning for me. A lot of different facets to this, and it's obviously polished to perfection. You see these wood grains and the sort of natural texture of wood, of course, which gets me every time. I feel like that happens with the most of you ZMF aficionados. And of course, a very sort of classic ZMF look with very luxurious pads, and they give you a second set of pads. The pads do have an effect on how you perceive the sound. And a supremely comfortable headband, right? With dual straps. And this is calfskin from what I know. So it's just very luxurious, as is the case with every ZMF. What happens with ZMF, unlike any other manufacturer, perhaps with the exception of the Meze Empyrean and the Meze Elite, is that you do get a sense of good ROI on your investment, because with everything else, especially with HiFiMan, if you think about what a Susvara looks like, and nowadays what a Susvara unveiled, the new headphone from HiFiMan looks like, you just don't get a sense of getting value for money. Because say if you're into other hobbies like watches or cars, I mean, if you pay a lot of money, you're also paying not just for craftsmanship or for performance. So of course you want performance, which for headphone means technical performance, which for cars, of course, you all know what that means. And for watches, it could mean the horology and the complications of a watch. But when you pay a lot of money, you do expect the finest quality of parts. With Rolexes, for example, you're going to want really high quality steel, really high quality finish, etc. That doesn't happen with HiFiMan. And even Dan Clark headphones don't often look the part. They can look cheap. Focal has had issues with headphones falling apart, especially the Utopia, which had a lot of driver failures in the past. Not so much with ZMF, because with ZMF you get a lifetime driver warranty. You get exquisitely built headphones, and I just love ZMF for that. So what do you get in the box? Well, you of course get your the customary Pelican case. And inside you get a set of pads. I got this as an extra set of pads. This, I think, is a different set of protein leather pads. And what I have here, I think, is I think I have the protein leather pads in here, because you can of course feel protein leather. It feels very different from actual leather. And this is, I think, the calfskin pads. And you can get the suede pads, etc. The pad system, of course, is interesting for ZMF. It does remind me a little bit of the Abyss 12665 TC. I mean, not so much, because I think in many ways it's a better all-rounder headphone and a better looking headphone. But what happens here is you get these narrower parts that sit here, and the meatier part sort of cradling your ear. And what happens because of this is it enhances the perception of stage, according to Zach. So if you wear it like this, and it does isolate very well, that's also worth keeping note. If you wear it like this, so these cups are bulbous, as is pretty evident, but that's with every high-end closed back at this level of performance that gives this kind of stage that this does. And I will draw a comparison to the Dan Clark EC3 by the end of this, so you get a sense of how this fares with regard to the EC3. But what happens because with this sort of pad shape is that because the narrower part is here and you have the thicker part here, A, it sits very nicely on top of your head and is very comfortable, and B, you get more airiness. And the airiness and stage also comes from the atrium damping system, which ZMF and Zach have perfected, so it does sound very spacious, and I'll come to that in greater detail when I talk about technicalities. And the final thing you want to know about how this is configured to be is that this has a Caldera magnet system, the CMS, I think, or CAMS, I think is what they call it. And the Caldera magnet system does make for a more bouncy, robust, impactful, dynamic, punchy experience, which I think all of you liked with the first Caldera, and this is no different. It's a very punchy, dynamic headphone. I do think the dynamism and punch and sheer viscerality of the upper mids, because upper mids of the Caldera Open was very, very crystalline, and it even defeated the Susvara, as was reviewed by me. And as I mentioned in my first review, where I A-B'd the Susvara and the Caldera Open. So the Caldera or Caldera, I'm switching between the pronunciations. I'm sorry. I've heard Zach pronounce it Caldera. I've always pronounced it Caldera. But anyway, I hope you don't mind me switching between the two pronunciations. So the Caldera Open had this extreme transparency and extreme clarity to the upper mids, which this does not. This has more clarity than you'll need, of course. It's not by any means a headphone that sounds unclear. It doesn't sound unclear. The pin gain is very adequate. However, the Caldera Open is tuned, and it's also an open headphone, right? And I think with what happens with closed headphones is if it's tuned for excessive clarity, like if you have a really protruding pin gain, it can sound more fatiguing. With an open headphone, I think you can afford to tune it that way, as is the case for Susvara, which has a lot of pin gain, and the Caldera Open, which I think sounds to have more clarity than the Susvara. This has clarity. And the reason I get into the, sort of dynamics and I'm talking about clarity is that this has clearly a more sophisticated damping system, right? And this needed to have a more sophisticated damping system because it's a closed back. And Zach is by now clearly perfect at the art of damping because it's damped so well. It has the elements of a Caldera Open in that it's as resolute. Of course, an open headphone sounds ever so slightly more resolute or resolving, but this is still extremely resolving. More resolving than I think most headphones in its price class even. This, like the Caldera Open, using that sort of magnet structure, sounds very punchy and thumpy and impactful in the bass. But the Caldera Open does also have slightly more incisiveness because, again, it's an open headphone. However, this also has the same sort of treble structure as the Caldera Open, which is saying a lot because it's very difficult to get a closed headphone to have a similar treble tuning as an open headphone and have that airiness and that beautiful ethereal treble that both the Caldera Open and the Caldera-Closed also has. So how they tune the treble like this is, of course, a marvel for me. It's amazing for me, and I'm not exactly sure how they've done it, but I'm humbled by this great tuning, Zach. If you're listening to this video or viewing this video, amazing job, man, in tuning this. It just sounds so silky, smooth in the treble, and overall, it's a slightly smoother experience than the Caldera Open. Okay, so with that enormous preface out of the way, and now you have a sense of what you get by way of a summary. And of course, the two other things I ought to mention is that this has an impedance of 60 ohms. So it's not as high impedance as other ZMF headphones. So you don't need a tube amp. You never needed a tube amp with ZMF, but of course, with impedance matching, when you have a high impedance OTL headphone and a ZMF headphone or a Sennheiser 600 series headphone or a Sennheiser 800 series headphone, you do get great results. You get usually an large stage, and you also get a better bass. This has such a great bass that you probably don't even need to think of an OTL. You can drive this with your dongle. You can drive this with your DAP I have. And it does attain the characteristics of each of the sources that I drive it with. And the final thing worth mentioning is that this has some weight. This is around 540 grams, I think. The weight does go up and down depending on whether you're using magnesium in your chassis and all that. But this weight is so well distributed that, as you can see, and it's so comfortable that ever since I put it on, I haven't taken it off. And I think you'll find that it's very comfortable. The weight will not be an issue for you because it's so well distributed, the weight. Okay, to talk about tonal performance or tonality, I mean, I've seen the FR that Zach has shared in one of his intro videos, and it looks beautiful to me. An FR and how you read it is very subjective. At least it is for me, because I feel like the experience of FR is something that I think is... so I'll tell you why I find it subjective. So in general, I've seen that I gravitate towards different kinds of FRs, right? I don't think there's only one FR that satisfies me. I do think tuning a headphone is an art and not a science. If you think of how... and I think this analogy is valid. If you think how the greatest pianos in the world are tuned, they're tuned by ear, right? So it is an art. And I think you'll also see that different tuners will tune pianos differently. So you have to make for that subjective experience in audio. And I think it's a bit of a foolhardy and foolish to chase a neutral curve And I think for any one of you who's trained in statistics will understand the limitations of coming up with a neutral curve. So there are limitations to coming up with a neutral curve for two reasons. One has to do with statistics or science. You have to have an adequate sample size representative of different subsamples within the audiophile community, making space for different subsamples in terms of genres people listen to then come up with a master curve. And that is a very exhaustive exercise. And the Harman exercise, research exercise, didn't even go close to that sort of depth and complexity. So that, of course, is not something that a lot of you will be enthused to listen or be interested in, because it gets into the world of statistics and how a target graph should be set and how a sample size or sampling methodology should be set. That's what I do for a living. So I know for a fact how inaccurate that sort of sampling was. And then to come up with that sort of graph, the Harman curve to me is a very populist graph. It's not necessarily an audiophile graph, because to have so much bass and so much upper mids, and it creates a wow factor when you listen to a Harman headphone the first time, because you don't get treble, and most people are sensitive to treble. Treble sensitivity goes down with more experience. It does. It's not just a function of age, and I've seen this with different people who start the hobby with different levels of treble sensitivity, and even younger people I've seen get over the sensitivity after a couple of years, even right once they listen to more high-end headphones and more trebly headphones. So Harman doesn't have the treble, so most people like the fact that they don't have the treble. And Harman has a lot of upper mids. And most people in the first year headphone, if you have a very forward upper mids, you get a sense of vocal intimacy and you get a sense of a mid-range resolution just because it's so forward. That also attracts people to Harman. And then you have bass, and most people like bass, right? It's like steak. Most people like steak. So Harman is a populist target. It's not necessarily the target that I think most audiophiles like, especially a lot of experienced audiophiles will want different kinds of tuning. And like what Zach says about Harman, Zach talks about how Harman is something he respects, but he doesn't necessarily always adhere to. And every time he deviates from Harman, it's a conscious decision, and he thinks about those deviations carefully. This does deviate from Harman, and thank God it does. So in terms of deviations, this has more bass than Harman, not in absolute quantity, thank God. This has more bass in the sense that it's spread out over a larger area, and it does still go down around 200 hertz, which basically means that, and so what I mean by more bass is it's got more balanced bass. The bass is distributed more evenly between sub bass and mid bass, which is just amazing. Which doesn't work with Harman, because Harman only has sub bass. This has more sub bass and mid bass than Harman, so you get a bass that just shows up, a bass that just turns up, sounds impactful. You get the entire spectrum of bass. It's a beautiful bass. It's one of the best renditions of bass I've heard. I think I've said this in one or two Facebook posts on the Head 5 Facebook page, how this is in many ways a microscope into the bass because of the planar driver. It's so resolving. You get so much information from the bass. It's just stunning. But then you get the bass coming down at the appropriate level, so the bass comes down by 200 hertz, and it just sounds amazing because of that. There's no bleed into the mids, and then you get your rise in around the pinna gain region. And again, the pinna gain, so the bass is not as moundy or as mountainous, as high peaky as Harman. So of course the upper mids also come down in proportion to that. So these are also other things we have to keep in mind. Like if you have the Harman curve, you have this bass level and this upper mids level. And people sometimes have a bass level that's way down from Harman, but then you still have the upper mids of Harman. That to me gets fatiguing, and that's what happens with the Susvara, I think. Over time, I find Susvara fatiguing. Because you remove the Harman level bass, but you still have the Harman level mids, but the mids should also come down, right? Upper mids should come down. Because you hear everything in relation to everything else, especially with frequency responses. So what Zach does is he gets his upper mids down to balance the bass, and it sounds great. It sounds very balanced. It sounds ever so slightly laid back even. It reminds me of the Dita Perpetua for that reason, because of this ever so slight laid back nature. But to counteract the laid back nature, what Zach does is he tunes his treble beautifully. So the treble is never into grating territory or bright territory or offensive territory, but it's very extended. So you get mid treble energy, you get upper treble energy, but it's all very balanced out. And what he also does is a lot of his upper treble is sort of situated after 15 kilohertz. So you get all the benefits of that, right? If you've ever seen sort of frequency response graphs of DAC filters, like for example, I had the Matrix X Saber Pro, and you see what part of the frequency response is tweaked with, to offer different kinds of tuning, especially transparency and just airiness and the feeling of staginess. It's upper treble. Like a lot of people, like you'll see, like if you read the if you see the FR graphs in the sort of brochure that Matrix gives you to understand how the filters have an effect, like Matrix DACs have filters, right? And the filters actually work. And you see graphs associated with each filter. You'll see that how much energy you have around 16 kilohertz or 17 kilohertz often decides how much space or how much airiness you perceive. And of course, not everyone will listen all the way up to 16 kilohertz. I do. I've tested for that. So I think the treble tuning here is masterclass, and it's a lot of what gives it the sense of stage. Now, to move on to a discussion on technical performance, guys, technically this is a goddamn powerhouse. So it's got a lot of impact. Like I said, the dynamics are just class leading. It's ever so slightly damped compared to the Caldera Open, and that had to be the case because a lot of people who have closed back headphones, a lot of people shy away from closed back headphones because they have lots of sort of ENT issues, and they feel they need the sort of open back nature of headphones because they have tinnitus or what have you. So this damping is important, and this damping takes away the extreme visceral nature, the superb visceral nature, the delicious visceral nature of the Caldera Open, just enough for you to not be bugged by, let's say, if you have tinnitus. And because with a closed back, things do sound more impactful, right? So he just adjusts for that. At the same time, you still have that character, and it's very apparent that Zach spends more of his time thinking about these tunings, thinking of how the tuning of Caldera Open should transfer to the tuning of Caldera-Closed. And he's just thought so much about this. He's done so much work about it. It's pretty evident that this is done very, very purposefully. So the damping is wonderful, and so the point I'm trying to make is that while it's extremely impactful, the Caldera Open does sound ever so slightly more impactful, and the Caldera Open gets away with it because it's an open back. And I don't mean to use a phrase "gets away with it" because most of you will love the fact that it's so impactful, the Caldera Open, right? And most of us are craving that impact because we don't get that impact with planar headphones. Think of HiFiMAN headphones or Dan Clark headphones. They sound poofy in the bass. They sound poofy, and people will say, "Oh, if you EQ the bass, the Susvara will start slamming like an abyss." Guys, that doesn't happen. I mean, people are claiming that, I just feel like aren't even audiophiles. I mean, they haven't even listened to these headphones long enough, I feel. Because if you EQ a Susvara, it's never going to start slamming like a Caldera. It just won't. Like, this is an analogy I like using with some of my friends. Like, the Susvara bass sounds like you're being hit with a pillow. Now, if you EQ the bass, it just sounds like you're being hit harder with the pillow. So it's still a very pillowy bass. The bass will not alter its essential characters, basically what I'm trying to say. And it depends a lot on the magnet system, it depends a lot on the driver system, etc., on the housing itself. This headphones is tuned and made to sound impactful with ever so slightly more damping going on here. So dynamics are just masterclass. Resolution is the same as the Caldera Open, but I do think the Caldera Open sounds slightly more resolving in the mid-range, not in the bass. I think this bass resolution is just masterclass, and it might even be more resolving in the bass than the Caldera Open. Treble, I think, is a bit of a tie. Now, soundstage is something I think is really worth getting into with the Caldera-Closed because it's even more spacious sounding than the Atrium Closed and even more spacious sounding than the Verite Closed. All the ZMF headphones, CMF makes the best closed back headphones on the planet. Of that, there is no doubt. The only headphone manufacturer that comes close to ZMF is Dan Clark, and that's only because of the EC3. The EC3 is an extraordinary headphone, especially for the price. It's light, it's resolving, it's fast, it's spacious, and even has a little more bass impact than every other Dan Clark headphone. I would still take the Caldera-Closed over the EC3, and that's because the Caldera-Closed has a much better timbre, so it's a technical performance in that sense. The Caldera-Closed sounds much more impactful. It just is a more robust, more impactful experience, and the stage sounds wider for the Caldera-Closed, right? It is the atrium damping system at play, so what I really like is that when I perceive stage, there are no holes in the stage. Like with a lot of closed backs, you get a 3-blob effect, so you get images coming from here. You'll never get images coming diagonally from here. You get images coming from here. With the Caldera-Closed, it's a very closed and contiguous circle of images, an arc of images, and you appreciate this because it sounds realistic, it sounds lifelike. Like in real life, you often don't perceive like holes on a stage, right? Images are not so distinct that they're so distinct. Like, you get massive holes on a stage. With open backs, of course, you're able to avoid that, especially with high-end open backs. What this does also, and I think everything down from the atrium damping system to the pads structure to the perforations in the pads has been tweaked and worked on by Zach to ensure this sort of maximal stage experience. And it's wide, it's fairly deep, and the stage experience is very authentic and open back-like. And imaging is also very precise and just very exciting. Resolution I've talked about. And lastly, timbrally, like I said, it's a wonderful headphone. It's a ZMF. It's a planar ZMF, so it doesn't necessarily have the timbre of an atrium open or an atrium closed. But if the atrium open and atrium closed is like 100 out of in timbre, this is like a 95 because it's still a ZMF. It's a wood-based headphone. It sounds timbrally accurate. So all that's there. Guys, parting thoughts. I mean, I think this is a superior headphone to every other closeback that I've heard. The only other closeback that gives this a run for its money, and a serious run for its money, and is perhaps on the same level as the headphone, is the Atrium Closed. The Atrium Closed is still going to be my go-to headphone for classic rock, just because that dynamic driver sounds merciless in bass. And I just love how it's also got a little more excitement, and so that is just perfect for rock. This is better for all-day listening, because this gives you, if you like rock, you're not going to take this off because it's just stunning for rock. But it does vocals really well, it does jazz really well, and it's just awesome for all-day listening because it just lacks that last bit of fatigue that I think is something that you find with a lot of high-end headphones. The Verite Closed is a masterclass headphone and everyone's favorite and a legend, honestly. The Verite Closed is warmer, thicker, more romantic, and that's the sort of sound it goes with, more mid-bassy. This has mid-bass. This you definitely feel mid-bass. You might even feel it ever slightly more than sub-bass. But the sub-bass here is so present, so dominant, that you'll never feel like what you feel with the Utopia even, where the mid-bass takes over. And the Focal Stellia is, of course, still a good headphone, but I do find the Stellia to be a bit outdated. The Stellia does have a few things that are, I think, wrong with it. This mostly the fact that it's got a lot of upper mids, it's got a lot of mid-bass, and it just sounds muddy and clouded for that reason, and sounds plasticky and metallic is probably the right expression for the Stellia. It just doesn't sound right timbrally, which is a problem with most Focal headphones. And I do think it's the quality of their drivers. Not because they're poor quality, it's just a quality of the drivers, meaning it's property of the drivers in terms of how the timbre effect goes on. And if you want to compare with open backs, guys, I mean, if you, let's say, wanted to compare it with Susvara, which a lot of people like comparing every headphone to, the Susvara looks extremely cheap compared to a ZMF headphone, so that's there. A Susvara also, it sounds more trebly and bright. Susvara is more resolving, faster. Is it more open sounding? Susvara certainly has a deeper stage. And I've talked about this Susvara staging feature in a previous video also. I think it was the Caldera Open video. The Susvara still has a weird sort of a blobby stage, like especially right to left. The images sometimes, depending on what amp you're driving it with, sound extremely intimate. It doesn't really sound coherent with, let's say, the forward image, which is pushed further back. This doesn't have these kind of issues. It's a very coherent arc, and it's far more impactful in the Susvara. It's timbrally just at a different level from the Susvara, and perhaps a much better all-rounder and more suited for all-day listening compared to Susvara. So that's it, guys. I just wanted to drop a number of comparisons so you get a sense of what this sounds like. I hope this review was useful. I do hope to talk about the Caldera-Closed more in subsequent videos. If you like this video, give this a like. If you like my work, follow my channel, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye-bye.